11 years of annexation of Crimea. A history of capture and resistance. On February 27, 2014, armed men in green uniforms seized administrative buildings in Crimea. And on March 16, a so-called referendum was held in Crimea, after which the Kremlin announced the annexation of the peninsula and its accession to Russia. What events preceded the occupation and why was it possible? A sharp turn towards Russia. Throughout 2013, the Ukrainian government has been declaring its intention to sign an association and free trade agreement with the EU at the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius in November. On November 9, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych met in Moscow. As the media reported almost a year later, Putin promised the Ukrainian president many economic benefits, including a discount on gas if he refused to sign an agreement with the EU. Otherwise, the Russian president threatened to start a trade war that would destroy the Ukrainian economy. On November 20, Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt condemned Russia's pressure on Ukraine, tweeting, "Russia is reportedly radically increasing pressure on Ukraine, brutal policy of threats and coercion, seeking obedience." In an interview with AFP, the president of Lithuania, which holds the EU presidency, Dalia Grybauskaitė, promised that after the signing of the association agreement, the European Union will help Ukraine cope with pressure from third countries. To which Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that the EU is shamelessly pressuring the Eastern Partnership countries to sign the association agreement. On November 21, 2013, the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, headed by Mykola Azarov, decided to suspend the process of preparing for the signing of the association agreement with the European Union, explaining this by the interests of Ukraine's national security. At the same time, the Ukrainian government instructed to restore active dialogue with the Russian Federation and other countries of the Customs Union and CIS member states to revive trade and economic ties with the aim of preserving and strengthening the state's economic potential through joint efforts. On the evening of November 21, journalists, public activists, and students began to gather on Independence Square in Kyiv, dissatisfied with the country's refusal to integrate into Europe. The hashtag Euromaidan appeared on social networks. A week later, on November 29, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement with the European Union at the EU summit. It became completely clear the Ukrainian authorities are choosing a course toward Russia, not Europe. Euromaidan Heavenly 100, Yanukovych's flight. On the evening of November 29, many people who disagreed with the sharp turn in the state's policy gathered in the center of Kyiv. Buses with Berkut special forces arrived in the capital from other regions. On the night of November 30, security forces dispersed students from Independence Square, citing a desire to clear space for a New Year's tree. By the way, since 2014, the country's main tree has been placed on Sofia Square. The next day, protests in central Kyiv flared up with renewed vigor and did not stop. Ukrainians demanded the resignation of the government and early elections. Over the course of 3 months, not only tents but also barricades appeared in the center of the Ukrainian capital, which were periodically stormed by the Berkut. Protesters occupied the building of the Kyiv City State Administration, tore down monuments to Lenin, and burned buses of security forces. At the end of February 2014, the revolution in Ukraine reached its climax. On February 18, the most massive clashes between protesters and security forces began on Independence Square. The trade union house burned down. Shootings of protesters began. At the same time, at a session of the Verkhovna Rada, the opposition demanded the return of the parliamentary presidential form of government and the restoration of the 2004 constitution. Over 3 days, more than 100 people were shot on the streets of Kyiv. They were later called the Heavenly 100. While the world's attention was focused on events in Ukraine, the Russian city of Sochi was hosting the Winter Olympics, which were scheduled to end on February 23. At the same time, the Western press was already writing about the fact that after the end of the Olympics, Russia could more actively interfere in Ukrainian politics and even occupy Crimea and eastern Ukraine. In particular, such a forecast, citing high-ranking EU officials, was published by Reuters on February 17, 2014. On February 21, it became known that Viktor Yanukovych left Kyiv and then fled to Russia through Crimea. On February 22, 2014, the Verkhovna Rada stripped Yanukovych of his powers as president of Ukraine. Early elections were scheduled for May 25, 2014. On the same day, Oleksandr Turchinov took over as the head of the Ukrainian parliament. On February 23, according to the Constitution of Ukraine, he became acting president of Ukraine. The beginning of the operation to return Crimea. It was on February 23 that Vladimir Putin gave the order to carry out the operation to return Crimea. He announced this date in an interview in the film Crimea, The Path to the Motherland, shown on the Russia TV channel a year after the annexation of the peninsula. The situation in Ukraine has developed in such a way that we are forced to begin work on returning Crimea to Russia, because we cannot abandon this territory and the people who live there to the mercy of fate, to the steamroller of nationalists. I set certain tasks, said what and how we should do it, Putin said, but I immediately emphasized that we will do this only if we are absolutely convinced that the people who live in Crimea themselves want it. On the same day, a rally of People's Will Against Fascism in Ukraine took place in Sevastopol. Its participants held posters reading, "Russia, we have been abandoned, take us back," and "Putin is our president." Several thousand city residents took part in the rally. According to journalists, many of them were employees of the Tavrida Electric Company, which belonged to the major businessman Alexei Chaly. He was elected people's mayor. Thus, Sevastopol effectively came under Russian control. 3 years later, in February 2017, in an interview with TASS, Chaly said that preparations for the return of Crimea had been going on for many years. In 2004-2005, we were preparing for active actions for the first time in connection with the Orange Revolution. But a legally sound basis for our actions could only appear if a period of lawlessness arose, when it was impossible to remain within the framework of the law if they stopped speaking to you in the language of the law. In 2004-2005, this did not happen. Then, in Kiev, there was a practically legitimate transfer of power. Exactly the same critical period was in 2008 during the war in South Ossetia. Yushchenko was the president of Ukraine. The Russian Black Sea Fleet took part in the operation, and when they were returning to Sevastopol to their main base, Yushchenko gave the order not to let them in. In general, it was completely witty not to let an armed fleet into its own base. This is a provocation at a level close to a declaration of war. I will not go into details, but in fact it was very close to this. But the officers simply did not dare to shoot at each other, living in the same city, looking each other in the eye. Then we were also preparing to seize power in the city, but it didn't work out. In 2014, everything worked out, but the situation wasn't moving towards that quickly either, TASS quotes him as saying. Vladimir Putin said the exact opposite on the direct line in April 2014. Russia has never planned any annexations or any military actions in Crimea, never. But we have also always thought and hoped that our Russian people, Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, would live in comfortable political conditions for themselves, in a comfortable environment, and would not be oppressed in any way. They would not be threatened. That's when exactly this situation arose, a situation with possible threats and oppression, and when the people of Crimea began to say that they were striving for self-determination, then of course, we thought about what to do. And it was then, and not some 5, 10, 20 years ago, that the decision was made to support the Crimeans. Sevastopol as the starting point of occupation and the Black Sea Fleet as a bridgehead. It was Sevastopol that became the starting point for the occupation of Crimea, since, according to the agreement between Russia and Ukraine, the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, its main naval complement and marines were based there. On February 24, 2014, the Olympic Squadron of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, ships that provided security for the Sochi Olympics NV, took on board in Novorossiysk Special Forces units of the airborne troops and marines with combat equipment for the occupation of Crimea, and set out on a course for Sevastopol. Andrei Klimenko, head of the monitoring group at the Institute of Black Sea Strategic Studies, describes the initial stage of the annexation. On February 25, the squadron of the Russian Black Sea Fleet returned to the already effectively captured Sevastopol after the end of the Olympics in Russia and delivered several thousand paratroopers with weapons from Novorossiysk. In March 2015, retired Admiral Igor Kasatonov, who commanded the Black Sea Fleet in 1991-1992, admitted that the Black Sea Fleet had prepared a springboard for the annexation of Crimea, and that the Sevastopol base was used to deliver polite people to Crimea. We can say that the Black Sea Fleet prepared a bridgehead. The officers knew what was going on around them, where the Ukrainian units were located. Scenarios for the development of events were worked out on maps. That is, the Black Sea Fleet coped with its tasks, polite people were delivered. The Supreme Council of Crimea was taken from February 27 to 28, he said in an interview with RIA Novosti. And he added, polite people are Army Special Forces. Thus, having established control over Sevastopol, Russia received a springboard for capturing the entire territory of the Crimean Peninsula. Resistance in Simferopol. The first major resistance rally in Crimea took place on February 23. Thousands of Crimean Tatars gathered in front of the Council of Ministers building in Simferopol, demanding the dissolution of parliament and amendments to the constitution to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. I felt how extraordinary the situation was. I urgently convened the Mejlis and we once again called on people to come to the rally, said the head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatars, Reshat Ametov. On February 26, a larger rally took place outside the Crimean parliament in Simferopol, with supporters of the pro-Russian movement Russian Unity, led by Sergei Aksionov, and activists of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis led by Mustafa Djemilov and Reshat Ametov demanding that the issue of calling a referendum on the status of Crimea, scheduled for that day at a parliamentary session, not be considered. The pro-Ukrainian participants in the rally managed to get the session of the Crimean parliament postponed. In 2020, the President of Ukraine, by his decree, established February 26 as the official day of resistance to the occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. The first little green men and polite people. On February 27 at 4:30 a.m., armed men in green uniforms without identification marks, they would later be called Little Green Men, seized the buildings of the Council of Ministers and the Supreme Council of Crimea in Simferopol. They did not put forward any demands and refused to negotiate with the authorities. The city center was cordoned off by the police and transport was sent on a detour. Detachments of self-defense forces appeared in the city, allegedly created by local residents due to threats to the Russian-speaking population of the peninsula from Ukrainian ultranationalists. On the same day, an extraordinary session of the Crimean parliament took place, with the Russian tricolor already flying over the building. The leader of the Russian Unity movement, Sergei Aksionov, was appointed Prime Minister of Crimea. On the Perekop Isthmus and in Chongar, posts were set up from the Berkut Special Forces who refused to carry out orders from Kiev. The Kerch ferry crossing was closed. Over the next 2 weeks, green uniformed troops successively blocked Ukrainian military bases and strategic facilities, including military airfields. Russian officials continued to claim that there were no Russian troops in Crimea. Thus, the Russian ambassador to the European Union, Vladimir Chizhov, said in an interview with Euronews, "There are no troops there at all, at least Russian ones." When asked by a Bloomberg correspondent about a uniform that was very similar to the Russian one, Vladimir Putin replied, "Go to our store and you will buy any uniform there." Referendum and the first victims of the occupation of Crimea. On March 1, 2014, Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, Sergei Aksionov, appealed to the President of the Russian Federation with a request to assist in ensuring peace and tranquility on the territory of Crimea. On the same day, Vladimir Putin sent a proposal to the Federation Council to introduce Russian troops into the territory of the peninsula. Both chambers of the State Duma voted for. Then the occupation authorities switched off the Ukrainian television broadcast, and the Crimean television airwaves were filled with federal Russian TV channels. Complete control over local media was established. It became dangerous for Ukrainian and foreign journalists to take photos and videos of the seizure of state institutions and strategic facilities. Nevertheless, pro-Ukrainian activists still tried to hold events under the slogan, "Crimea is Ukraine." The largest protest took place on March 8 when about 15,000 people, mostly women and children, lined up along roads throughout Crimea, holding Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar flags and posters calling for peace. At the same time, Crimean Tatar activists who opposed the Russian occupation of the peninsula began to disappear in Crimea. The first victim is said to be Reshat Ametov. On March 3, 2014, he went to the building of the Crimean government with a solitary picket against the referendum. Video cameras recorded him on Lenin Square in front of the government building. The video also captured the moment when several representatives of the Crimean self-defense twisted his arms and put him in a car. 2 weeks later, he was found murdered. Numerous signs of torture were found on the man's body. His head was tied with duct tape and handcuffs were found nearby. The cause of death, as was later established, was a stab wound to the eye. Ametov's murder has not been solved to this day. In 2017, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko posthumously awarded Reshat Ametov the title of Hero of Ukraine. In its report, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights calls the murder of a Crimean man an extrajudicial execution. From the beginning of the military operation to seize the peninsula until the summer of 2014, more than 24 high-profile kidnappings took place in Crimea. Among those who were captured by Russian security forces and self-defense forces were Euromaidan participants who had come to Crimea, journalists, and Ukrainian military personnel. According to the Crimea SOS report, the armed group Self-Defense of Crimea, created several days before the rally on February 26, 2014, near the building of the Supreme Council of Crimea, took part in the kidnappings. The authors of the report claim that the practice of abductions in Crimea is one of the elements of intimidation and maintaining fear among the population, especially among disloyal Crimean Tatars. All cases of kidnappings committed during this period have the character of a planned operation. Most of those kidnapped were released through negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian officials, the authors of the report note. On March 6, the Crimean parliament passed a resolution to hold a pan-Crimean referendum on the status of the peninsula. Crimeans were asked to answer one of two questions in the affirmative. Are you for the reunification of Crimea with Russia as a subject of the Russian Federation? Or are you for the restoration of the 1992 Constitution of the Republic of Crimea and for the status of Crimea as part of Ukraine? According to calculations, more than 96% of respondents voted for the peninsula to become part of Russia. The results of the referendum were not recognized by Ukraine, the European Union, the United States, or a number of other countries. Vladimir Putin, our servicemen have stood behind the Crimean self-defense forces. On March 18, 2014, the treaty on the entry of the territory of the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol into the Russian Federation was signed between the Russian Federation, represented by Russian President Vladimir Putin, and representatives of the occupation authorities Sergei Aksyonov, Vladimir Konstantinov, and Alexei Chaly. On April 17, 2014, during a direct line, Vladimir Putin admitted, "Of course, our military personnel stood behind the Crimean self-defense forces. They acted very correctly, but as I already said, decisively and professionally. It was simply impossible to hold a referendum in an open, honest, dignified way and help people express their opinions in any other way." In March 2014, Russia annexed the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. International organizations recognized the annexation of Crimea as illegal and condemned Russia's actions, and Western countries imposed economic sanctions against it. The Kremlin denies the annexation of the peninsula and calls it restoration of historical justice.